Hello everyone. So for the fourth general principle, trade short-term advantages for long-term ones. Now short-term advantages by definition must be exploited quickly lest they dissipate. So by definition they're short-term advantages. You want to make use of them very quickly or they'll just go away. However, it is not solely necessary to win immediately. It is also possible to use a short-term advantage to transform the position in a way that leaves the stronger side with a long-term advantage. What I mean is that there are two ways. Either you use the short-term advantage very quickly and get a winning position and just crush your opponent if possible, or you turn that short-term advantage into a long-term advantage, which is the subject of this principle. Now long-term advantages of course won't dissolve rapidly, so one can slowly accumulate more and more of these long-term advantages until the other side collapses. Incidentally, this is a related principle. We will see this in the associated principles section. Now short-term advantages include such factors as a lead in development, extra piece mobility, space, initiative, tempos, an attack on the king, etc. While long-term advantages include static pawn weaknesses such as doubled pawns, isolated pawns, backward pawns, etc., the bishop pair, and of course a material advantage. Now a material advantage is in between kind of. So there's always also note that it's also a bit dimensional. There are very long-term advantages and there are very short-term advantages and there are in between and there are like middle-term advantages, I guess you could call them, but they lean more toward the short-term advantage or more toward the long-term advantage side. Note also that as the endgame nears, short-term advantages become less important and it is more crucial to transform them into long-term advantages before the position becomes too simplified. Because in the end game, short-term advantages, I mean the game is by definition at its end, so you shouldn't have short-term advantages that don't last long. So when does this principle not apply? The rare situations when this principle doesn't apply is when you have a short-term advantage, such as a violent attack, and its conclusion is checkmate and not the win of material. So in such a situation, not checkmating your opponent and instead transforming the advantage to a material advantage is not correct. That is of course if you do see the checkmate. I would like to refer you to the principle: when you see a winning move, play it, but only after triple checking it. End quote. So yeah, it's very important when you're attacking the other side and you have a checkmate. It's very important not to just transform that advantage and attack on the king, which is a short-term advantage, into some other advantage such as material gain. If you see a checkmate in 3, you're of course not going to win a piece and let the game go on for maybe 30 more moves. That is if you see the checkmate. If you don't see the checkmate, if you just see like maybe I have a check here that can win the queen, I meant to say maybe I'm 100% sure I can win the queen on this line, but I'm 80% sure I can checkmate the king in that other line. Of course you don't do that, you just go for the queen. You don't consider whether or not you can checkmate if you don't see it. That's another principle, by the way. We'll take a look at that later as well. Anyway, to the associated principles we go. So for the associated principles, it's going to be just one principle actually. Accumulate small positional advantages. While positional advantages are not always long-term, such as an open file for example, it's not so long-term. One should try to accumulate as many long-term advantages as is possible, and that includes for example having an open file. By gaining both short-term and long-term positional advantages and transforming the short-term advantages into long-term ones, one is able to quickly gain a very powerful position. Of course, if you have all of these advantages, that would be amazing. So yeah, remember to accumulate small positional advantages and to transform your advantages. So for the corollaries and sub-principles, it's very important that you keep in mind this lest they dissipate part I talked about. So you have to trade short-term advantages for long-term ones, lest the short-term advantages dissipate. You need to keep that in mind because it's very important to be quick with transforming these advantages, because again, if you don't, you might just lose the advantage, and that might even cost you the game, or at least make the game drawn or something if you have an advantage. This is especially true in gambit openings, of course, because in gambit openings, if you're not very quick in attacking or doing something with your advantage, your lead in development, that might mean that you just end up in a pawn down position for no compensation. So please keep that in mind. So the importance of the principle. On the exception scale, I would say that there are few exceptions to this principle, apart from attacks on the king and some such. You don't want to trade an immediate checkmate for a prolonged affair with an extra pawn. So therefore about an 8 or 9 out of 10 for this principle on the exception scale seems about right. On the importance scale, breaching this principle will not necessarily lose you the game, since by definition you already have a short-term advantage. So if you already have a short-term advantage, not transforming into a long-term one means you lose the advantage. Not that you lose the game necessarily, you just lose one advantage, or maybe all the advantages, but you might still have a drawn position. Now, having said that, your opponent might have their own advantages too, so yeah, I'm not really sure. So I would say about a 6 or 7 out of 10 on the importance scale, because I'm not really sure if you lose an advantage how much of a problem that's going to be, if that's going to be enough to cost you the game because your opponent will in turn take an advantage, or if it will just be drawn if you mess up and not transform your advantage. So yeah, I'll give it a 6 or 7 out of 10 on the importance scale. Alright guys, so for the famous game, none other than Akiba Rubinstein on the white side, and he's playing Fyodor Ivanovich Chotymirsky. Again, if you guys have any suggestions in terms of pronunciation, I'm all ears. Okay, so we arrive here. White has a huge advantage in terms of space. Just look at this, beautiful. But if he just sits on the position with the single advantage, he won't achieve much. Indeed, in the endgame, space matters little. Remember meta principle number 5, which I refer you to. So therefore, he slowly gains even more space until finally achieving a passed pawn on move 27. This outside passed pawn helps the genius GM Rubinstein win the game. So yeah, he knows that if he just has the space advantage and just sits on the position, doesn't get any new advantage, it's going to matter little in the endgame, and he's just going to have that space advantage, and it's not going to be enough to win. Instead, he transforms the space advantage into even more space, and he gets a passed pawn in return. So let's see how that happens. So first this, and now look, he captures with the rook and not the pawn, because he wants this passed pawn to become passed. This pawn to become passed. And soon enough, he defends a little, gains some control of the center, tries to trade queens. He's successful, and now the passed b pawn will tell a very different story. So we're going to see the famous Rubinstein technique, which is tremendous, especially in rook endgames. And now look at this beauty. Look at how he doesn't even capture the rook. He just comes here. And for a very specific purpose, of course, because he sees that this endgame is completely winning, and it is. Too many passed pawns. Black tries to get his own passed pawn, but it's not enough. White has far too many passed pawns. And now this is an easy technical win, and black resigned. So for the other example section, we have a really strong game here by an IM on Lichess and an untitled player who might be a secret IM or a GM, who knows. Yeah, so this game was played on the Lichess. And we're just going to go forward a bit. Yeah, black is getting control on the c file while white is getting control over on the d file. And now white has nice control on the open d file while black has control over the open c file. I just mentioned this. However, black has difficulty in entering white's position. The same though cannot be said about white. By playing 27 f5, black commits a big error, since not only does he miss the winning move, which is rook takes e4 here, rook takes e4 simply wins. Why? I leave this up to you guys. This isn't a game analysis video, so just I want to illustrate the point of the principle. So if you want to check out why rook takes e4 wins, please do so. Anyway, rook takes e4 wins, so let's go back to f5. So not only is it wrong because it doesn't allow the winning move to be played, which is rook takes e4, but he also gives white the opportunity to trade his short-term control of the open file for the long-term advantage of saddling black with a doubled pawn weakness in the endgame. Observe how white masterfully converts this long-term advantage. So here he plays queen d7, forcing the queen trade, and now after takes and takes here. Okay, sure, white does have doubled pawns himself, but notice that these pawns are connected, while these are double isolated pawns, which are really terrible. And let's see how white is able to convert this advantage. So this is a nice trick. If rook takes e2 check, we play king e2, and there are too many pieces that are being attacked. Actually, rook takes e2 check. I'll have to check with the engine because I haven't analyzed this. Because rook takes e2 check, king f1. So rook takes e2 check, king f1. And there's rook e1 check. You just go to f2. Yeah, sorry guys. So here you just go to f2 because the bishop doesn't have any squares where it can keep protecting this rook. If it goes here, you have b4. Yeah, of course I would have known this without the engine, so I shouldn't have checked. Anyway, bishop f8, and now he tries to trade. And okay, this is going to be a nice endgame win here. So tempos are being gained. He wins one pawn, and now he's going to win with the passed g pawn. Yep, this is a technical win. Study your endgames, guys, or your basic endgames. You don't need to study much more than that, to be honest, if you have good calculation skills. Yeah, and here the game is easily won. He even plays a checkmate and doesn't like pick up the pawns and make two new queens. Yeah, so very nice game. So again, remember guys, to trade your short-term advantages for your long-term ones. And here in this game, he traded the short-term advantage of it's not really a short-term advantage. Control of the open file is more of a long-term advantage, but it's much shorter term than doubled pawns, which are a very long-term advantage. Yeah, anyway, with that, I hope you got something out of this video. Take care, guys.